we talked about all having the same operating system, and the next thing then is all getting the students on the same page, not only with the operating system, but starting a lesson. And regularly we see error messages like this on the screen that students cause errors. So I will show you in a minute how to do an overall sort of a calculator restart sort of program. But before that, I'll show you some of the errors. The main three errors that are going to come up are either to do with stat plots, to do with window, or to do with y equals. So you can see here that this is the first error message that's coming up in the window range. If I go into window, this is quite common for the students to do, where they forget to put the negative in, which will cause an error, or that the min is a greater value than the max. And the other one they sometimes use, well, they'll use the take away, the subtract button, rather than, and it will still give us that. This is what Mel talked about the go to. So if I go to it, oh yeah, silly me, it's supposed to be negative. If I now go to the graph, it's now saying there's an invalid dim. That's where, although I have information already in my statistics page, in my stat plots, it's trying to plot a scatter plot of list 1 and list 3. And therefore, it doesn't match. There's no data, sorry, my Englishness is coming out in me. There's no information in list 3. So we need to sort that out. Easiest way for now would be just to turn them all off. You can turn them off individually. And let's go to graph now. It did it. I thought I had another error one. The other error one that some students like to do with each other, they like to mess around with each other's screens, is they like to hide. If I can scroll down, they like to hide errors down in here. So they like to hide it on their mates' calculators down here, and when that happens, it will also crash on the same thing. So one way, obviously you need to teach the students how to find all those errors and how to overcome them, especially in test and exam situations. But in a classroom context, if you want all the students on the same page to start with, then you would go second the memory. We're going to go to reset. I'm not big on scrolling down. I'm going to go number 7. It's going to change my view. I prefer this view. And then I'm going to look at both calculator screens. Although I have to say it's easier for me. For some reason, I don't know whether it's habit, but obviously when I'm pressing buttons on the calculator, I'm looking here, so it's sort of habit rather than looking slightly to the right. But I'll stick with this one. We're going to go then to all RAM, and it just gives you a little warning message. Now the only downside of doing this is that if you have some programs that the students have created, it will wipe those clean. So those can be saved by the students using TI Connect, or they can put it onto another calculator, but that's the only downside, is that these programs will get wiped. So we're going to press number 2. Now we can see that all your students will be on the same page. The window will all be the same. The y equals will all be clear. All the plots are off. And the statistics will also be clear. So we're all starting on exactly the same page. And that's a great way to start with your students. So with the new operating system, Mel said that it was updated a while ago, but I still think there's quite a few things that maybe we're not aware of. Or some people, there's always little tricks, like Mel said earlier, that we learn from each other. On the mode screen, this is pretty much the same, if not the same as the old operating system. But if I scroll up, I'm a bit lazy rather than scrolling down, we can see we have much more choices in here. The stats wizard is worth having on, and that will be automatically the default for it. The stats wizard is like the old catalogue help that we used to have. So we definitely would like that on to help us rather than have to remember the syntax on how to do questions like in LinReg and apps like that. The stat diagnostics, we used to have to go into catalogue and turn the diagnostics on. Once it was on, it stayed on, but we'll turn that on because that will give us our R and R squared much easier. I'm not going to worry about going to the format of graph. And then depending on what class you've got and what students, you can decide whether you want to have it on auto for the answers or whether you want to switch between decimals and fractions. So we get out of that. One of the really nice things is that we can scroll up and we can scroll up. Now, I can't scroll up because I've wiped everything clean. Should have realised that one, shouldn't I? So if I had some values in here, obviously we can do 5 times the previous answer. That was one of the ones we used to do. But it's quite nice now that if you want to go up, either to copy a value down, we can do, or if you want to copy an expression down, then we can do, and it will continue to work as normal. That's a really nice function. In terms of on top of the copying, if you want students to remember a number further up without having to scroll up to find it, then the store button is really useful. So if you did have a convoluted number, and I would only do a very basic one like the number 5, we can store that as any letter we like. Best to explain to the students not to store it as either X or Y, as those will get overwritten when they go into the graphing screen and do something on the graphing screen. So we'll just choose, let's go A, and until it gets written overwrote on this one, or you do a reset again, A will always be 5. And that doesn't affect the calculating what the students are doing unless they do a calculation, etc. I find this one really useful when students are having to sub a number into an equation. Sometimes they'll make mistakes, especially with negatives or squares. So if you get them to store the variables first and then just type the equation in, they were very unlikely to make a mistake. Obviously, they're not showing any workings out on their screen, but they're unlikely to make a mistake. The other main area that has been upgraded is that the function keys are now used to access those alpha F1. And we can see that in the first one, we have lots of fractions that we can now have access to because we've got it now in maths print, like the TI-84 XB. And if I go to number 2, I can then type in a fraction, and that's all well and good. It will also convert it to a top-heavy fraction. I can either go via math or back to here again. And if I wanted to convert it to a decimal, it will do that for me. I can keep pressing enter and it will convert it back. Or if I wanted to, I could also keep converting. And this is quite useful. We have a class set of TI-84s, and I take this in sometimes with my middle school students. They're not required to buy them at that age, but we use them with middle school students and get them to look at relationships between the fractions they're doing. And I find that quite useful as well. What else do we have? In F2, this is when I show my students this one, especially the senior students, they can't believe it and are so excited that they've got all this here now, ranging from a log with a base. So that makes their life a lot easier in terms of typing these the logs with different bases rather than 10 into their calculator and not having to remember extra things. But especially, as Mel showed earlier, the derivative or the integral, and very easy to use. And really nice to use in the y equals equation as well when you want students to differentiate a graph. So if we have 5x cubed, make sure that we come down from up there, plus 3x, and I want to find the derivative when x is 2. Enter. There we are. Very nice. Using those same functionalities in a few other areas, we could also go into stats, and if we had some data in here, let's just randomly type some numbers in, or loosely, and let's say that they're roughly, doesn't really matter, double, 9.8, let's go 12.3. If we're going to do a regression equation for this, then we would put out of this mode stats, across to calculate a linear regression. We can see now, because we've got it in Stats Wizard, a much nicer screen to show the students. Yep, that's where my X list is. Yep, that's where my Y list is. Is there a frequency? No, there's not for this one. Again, you have to remember the syntax for here, but I want to also store that as a regression equation. So I want it to be, I don't want to have to copy it across myself. I want the calculator to do it all for me. So I'm going to store that in the y equals area. I'm going to store it in y1. Again, we used to have to go via vars, but if we go to F4, we can see that there's y1. And now calculate. And there's all the information for my linear regression. How about that? There's a chance of that happening. Wow. Sorry. Just me that's interested in that one. That's a bit sad. Right, where are we? There's our R&R squared, because we've got the diagnostic on as well through the mode. It's automatically put it into Y1, and it's also going to graph it as well. The points aren't there, as I haven't got it on in stat plot, but I can put those on, and that's the line of best fit. Now, again, some students may want to or would like to use those numbers, scrolling up, that they've got from here. And every variable that comes up on the calculator, students can access. So if we go into vars, down to statistics, number 5, and scroll across, we'll see some of the variables that are used in that linreg. So if we typed in 2, it will come up with that number that was already from earlier. With my students, I encourage them then to store that as, let's say, capital A, so then they can easily access that and they don't have to worry and making notes either on their papers or on the exam paper of what that variable is saved under. The other advantage, going back to calculus, if we look here now at number 4, we're going to do an integral, let's say, between 1. I'm just using the arrow keys to move them. Yes, I could type an equation in here, but I've already got an equation in my y equals, so why don't I just use that one? Oh, that's interesting. Mel, do you see that?
I'm seeing that on your screen. Obviously, you'll just decide not to operate.
Let's hope that that's not going to worry me too much. Let's go back to here. Y1 with respect to x, and I missed the enter button, and there will be the answer. If we wanted to, we could go and draw that as well on the graph, but there we go, very easy done using the Y1 button. Equally, I could have, just to finish on this, used, and you obviously wouldn't use this mathematically, it doesn't really make any sense, the value I stored, and it also will give me an answer. I think, for now, that is all I would like to show you for there. Mel, can you think of anything else that we discussed?
No, that was pretty much all, I think, for making sure that students are on the same page, making sure they've got their modes set up right. So, yes.